January 1935. Harry Wimperis, Director of Scientific Research at the Air Ministry, sends an unusual request to a physicist named Robert Watson Watt. The question is simple enough. Can radio waves be used to build a death ray? Not a metaphorical one. A real beam of energy that could boil the blood of a pilot sitting in his cockpit, bringing down enemy aircraft before they reached British cities. The inquiry was not as absurd as it sounds today. German newspapers had been boasting about secret weapons. The Air Ministry had received letters from inventors claiming they could deliver exactly such a device. Someone needed to do the mathematics and settle the matter. Watson Watt, running the radio research station at Slough, seemed the right man to ask. He was not the obvious choice for saving a nation. No Oxford professorship, no Cambridge connections. Watson Watt was the son of a carpenter from Brechin, a small town in eastern Scotland that most Englishmen would struggle to find on a map. For 20 years, he had been studying radio waves, trying to track thunderstorms by detecting the electromagnetic signatures of lightning strikes. Useful work, but hardly the stuff of military legend. Now the government wanted to know about death rays. Watson Watt could have simply replied that the concept was nonsense and returned to his thunderstorms. Instead, he handed the calculations to a young colleague and asked him to check the numbers properly. What came back would change everything. The young colleague was Arnold Wilkins, a physicist with a particular talent for making complex problems simple. Watson Watt gave him a precise question, framed in terms that avoided mentioning the actual purpose. How much radio energy would it take to heat 8 pints of water from 98 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit at a distance of 5 kilometers? Wilkins was not fooled by the abstraction. 8 pints was roughly the amount of blood in a human body. 105 degrees was the point at which a pilot would lose consciousness from fever. His superior was asking him to calculate whether a death ray could work. Wilkins approached the problem methodically. Radio waves carry energy. That energy diminishes with distance according to well-understood laws. The amount reaching a target at 5 kilometers would be a tiny fraction of what left the transmitter. To deposit enough energy into a pilot's body to raise his temperature by 7 degrees would require a transmission of staggering power. Wilkins completed his calculations and brought them to Watson Watt. The answer was not encouraging for death ray enthusiasts. To achieve the desired effect would require more power than every generating station in Britain could produce combined. Not twice as much or 10 times as much, but orders of magnitude beyond anything that existed or could reasonably be built. The German newspapers, it seemed, had been printing propaganda rather than science. Whatever secret weapons Berlin might possess, a radio death ray was not among them. Watson Watt had his answer for the Air Ministry. He could have written a brief note explaining that the concept was physically impossible and returned to tracking thunderstorms. But Wilkins had added a footnote to his calculations. It was almost an afterthought, a casual observation that would reshape the defence of Britain. He remembered a report from post office engineers that had circulated a few years earlier. The engineers had been investigating complaints about radio reception. Listeners near certain transmission towers reported that their signals would occasionally fade and flutter for no apparent reason. The post office investigators traced the problem to aircraft. Planes flying through the broadcast beams were disrupting the signals. The metal bodies and wings were reflecting radio waves, scattering them in directions the transmitters had not intended. For the post office, this was a nuisance to be documented and filed away. For Wilkins, sitting in his office with death ray calculations in front of him, it suggested something else entirely. If aircraft reflected radio waves strongly enough to interfere with BBC broadcasts, then they reflected them strongly enough to be detected. You could not boil a pilot's blood from the ground. The energy requirements made that impossible, but you might not need to harm him at all. You might simply need to see him coming. The implications were profound. Britain in 1935 had no reliable way to detect approaching aircraft. The Royal Observer Corps maintained a network of volunteers who watched the skies with binoculars and reported what they saw by telephone. On a clear day, they might spot a formation at 10 or 15 miles. At night, or in cloud or in rain, they were effectively blind. Fighter Command could put aircraft into the air, but those aircraft had to find the enemy by luck and eyesight. Most patrols saw nothing at all. Sound detection offered slightly more range. Concrete acoustic mirrors had been built along the south coast, massive curved structures designed to focus the noise of distant engines onto microphones. These could sometimes detect aircraft at 20 miles, but they were slow, imprecise, and easily confused by wind or surf or passing ships. They also became less effective as aircraft flew faster, giving ever shorter warning times. A bomber traveling at 200 miles per hour would cover 20 miles in 6 minutes. Even perfect sound detection would give Fighter Command barely enough time to scramble. The strategic thinkers had largely given up. Stanley Baldwin, speaking in Parliament 3 years earlier, had declared that the bomber would always get through. No defence existed against massed air attack. The only deterrent was the threat of retaliation. Cities would burn, and the side with more bombers and stronger nerves would prevail. This was not defeatism, but the considered opinion of military professionals across Europe. Air defence was thought to be impossible. Radio detection, if it could be made to work, would overturn this assumption entirely. Radio waves travel at the speed of light. They pass through cloud and darkness without attenuation. A system that could send out a pulse and detect its reflection from an aircraft might see 100 miles or more, in any weather, day or night. At 100 miles, even a fast bomber would need 30 minutes to reach the coast. Fighters could be scrambled, positioned, and waiting. The mathematics suggested it was possible. The Post Office report suggested it was already happening by accident. Watson Watt recognised what Wilkins had found. On the 12th of February 1935, he sent a memorandum to the Air Ministry with a title so dry it could have been written by a chartered accountant: Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods. The document ran to several pages of technical discussion, but its essential message was straightforward. Death rays were fantasy. Radio detection was not. Given adequate funding and facilities, Watson Watt believed he could build a system that would spot enemy bombers long before they reached the British coast. The memorandum landed on the desk of the Tizard Committee, a group of scientists advising the Air Ministry on new technologies for air defence. They read it with considerable interest. Henry Tizard himself, a chemist who had flown combat missions in the previous war, understood both the science and the operational need. The other members brought expertise in physics, signals, and military research. They could see the potential, but scientists and civil servants are cautious people. They had seen promising ideas founder on practical difficulties. They had watched inventors demonstrate marvelous devices that worked perfectly in laboratories and failed completely in the field. The committee wanted proof, not a theoretical argument, however elegant, not calculations, however rigorous. They wanted to see radio waves bounce off an actual aircraft and return to a receiver. They wanted to watch the evidence appear on a screen. Watson Watt would have to demonstrate that his idea worked in the real world, not just on paper. This was reasonable enough. It was also urgent. Germany was rearming openly now. The Luftwaffe had been announced to the world in violation of the Versailles Treaty. Intelligence reports suggested that German aircraft production was accelerating. The Air Ministry estimated that within a few years Germany would have the capacity to devastate British cities from bases just across the Channel. If radio detection was going to matter, it needed to work soon. Watson Watt accepted the challenge. He would need a powerful radio transmitter, a suitable aircraft, and somewhere quiet to conduct the experiment. The transmitter was easy enough. The BBC maintained a shortwave station at Daventry in Northamptonshire, broadcasting to the Empire. It pumped out 10 kilowatts of power on a frequency that Watson Watt calculated should reflect nicely off metal surfaces. The BBC agreed to let him borrow their signal. Now he just needed to prove that Wilkins had been right. The Air Ministry arranged for an aircraft. They selected a Handley Page Hayford, a twin-engine biplane bomber that represented the current state of RAF heavy aviation. It was large, slow, and covered in metal-framed fabric that would present a reasonable radar cross-section. The pilot would be given a flight path that took him repeatedly through the BBC transmission beam at various altitudes. He was told nothing about the purpose of his mission. Secrecy was paramount. If the experiment worked, Britain would have an advantage that must be protected at all costs. If it failed, there was no need for anyone to know it had been attempted. Wilkins spent the days before the test preparing the receiving equipment. He assembled an array of antennas designed to pick up reflections from the Daventry transmitter. He calibrated an oscilloscope to display any returning signals. The equipment was loaded into a Morris delivery van that the radio research station used for fieldwork. It was not an impressive sight. The future of British air defence would depend on apparatus that looked like it belonged to a regional telephone repair service. Watson Watt chose the location with care. He needed to be close enough to the Daventry transmitter to receive a strong signal, but far enough that the direct transmission would not overwhelm the faint reflections from an aircraft. He settled on a field near the village of Upper Stowe, roughly 6 miles from the BBC mast. The field belonged to a local farmer who asked no questions about why government scientists wanted to park a van in his pasture on a cold February morning. The 26th of February 1935 was cold and grey, the kind of English winter morning that makes men question their career choices. Watson, Watt and Wilkins arrived at the field before dawn, parking the Morris van on a patch of firm ground and beginning the laborious process of setting up their equipment. The antenna wires had to be run out across the frozen grass and suspended from wooden poles they had brought with them. The oscilloscope needed time to warm up, its vacuum tubes glowing orange in the darkness of the van interior. They were joined by a single observer from the Air Ministry, A.P. Rowe, who served as secretary to the Tizard Committee. Rowe was there to witness whatever happened and report back to his superiors. He was not a physicist himself, but he understood enough to know what he was looking at. More importantly, he understood the political and military stakes. If this demonstration succeeded, it would need advocates in Whitehall who could secure funding and cut through bureaucratic obstacles. If it failed, Rowe would have to explain why the Air Ministry had wasted time and resources on another dead end. 3 men in a muddy Northamptonshire field, stamping their feet against the chill, waiting for an aeroplane. The farmer whose land they were using had been told only that government scientists needed to conduct some radio experiments. He had shrugged and gone about his morning chores. Cows needed milking, regardless of what the Air Ministry was doing in the back pasture. The Hayford appeared on schedule, a dark shape against the overcast sky, the drone of its 2 Bristol Pegasus engines audible long before the aircraft itself became clearly visible. The pilot followed his assigned course with military precision, flying toward the Daventry transmitter and then turning back, passing through the radio beam at around 6,000 feet. He had been told to maintain specific altitudes and headings at specific times. He had not been told why. The nature of his mission was classified at a level above his pay grade, which was the RAF way of saying that curiosity was discouraged. Inside the van, Watson, Watt and Wilkins hunched over the oscilloscope screen. The space was cramped and cold, their breath visible in the air despite the warmth from the electronic equipment. The cathode ray tube glowed with the steady signal from the BBC transmitter, a flat green line representing 10 kilowatts of radio energy pumping out across Northamptonshire. Somewhere in the ether, those radio waves were striking everything in their path: trees, buildings, hills, clouds, birds, and, if the theory was correct, the metal skin of a Handley Page bomber. Then the line jumped, a small deflection at first, barely visible, the kind of fluctuation that might be dismissed as electrical noise or a fault in the equipment. Wilkins leaned closer to the screen. The deflection grew stronger as the aircraft approached, the trace rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the bomber's course through the transmission beam. At 8 miles distance, the reflection was unmistakable. This was not noise. This was not a fault. Radio waves from the Daventry transmitter were striking the Hayford, bouncing off its metal framework and returning to the antennas in the field. The oscilloscope was displaying the presence of an aircraft that no human eye could see clearly at that range. Watson Watt said nothing. He simply watched, his face illuminated by the green glow of the cathode ray tube, as the blip swelled and faded with each pass of the bomber. 20 years of studying radio waves, 20 years of tracking thunderstorms and measuring atmospheric phenomena had led to this moment in a freezing van in a farmer's field. The proof was dancing on the screen in front of him. The Hayford made several passes, following its predetermined pattern with the mechanical reliability expected of RAF aircrew. Each time, the same result. The blip appeared as the aircraft entered the beam, strengthened as it flew closer to the receiving antennas, faded as it turned away, and headed back toward the transmitter. Wilkins noted the timings and signal strengths in a small notebook, his handwriting cramped by cold fingers. The correlations were precise. When the aircraft was in the beam, they could see it. When it flew outside the beam, it disappeared. Cause and effect, repeatable and measurable. Rowe observed from the back of the van, saying little but missing nothing. He was not qualified to judge the physics, but he could recognize success when he saw it. The two scientists were not celebrating, but neither were they troubled. Their equipment was detecting an aircraft at a distance of 8 miles using nothing but reflected BBC radio signals. This was not a laboratory curiosity. This was the foundation of something that could be built, scaled and deployed. The demonstration had been designed for simplicity. Watson, Watt and Wilkins were not transmitting anything themselves. They were merely receiving reflections from the Daventry broadcast, using the BBC as an unwitting collaborator. A proper detection system would need its own transmitter, its own frequencies, its own antennas designed specifically for the purpose. It would need to determine not just that an aircraft was present, but where it was, how high it was flying, and in what direction it was heading. All of that remained to be developed, but the fundamental question had been answered. Radio waves could find aeroplanes. The rest was engineering. The Hayford completed its final pass shortly before noon and turned for home, its pilot none the wiser about his contribution to British defence history. Inside the van, Wilkins began shutting down the equipment, while Watson Watt stepped outside to stretch his legs and light his pipe. The field looked exactly as it had that morning, muddy, unremarkable, the kind of place you would drive past without a second glance. Nothing about it suggested that the future of aerial warfare had just been demonstrated between its hedgerows. There were no celebrations that day, no champagne, no congratulatory telegrams, no photographs of grinning scientists shaking hands. The three men packed up their equipment methodically, coiled the antenna wires, loaded everything back into the van, and drove away separately. Watson, Watt and Wilkins returned to the radio research station at Slough. Rowe headed back to London to brief the Tizard Committee. The farmer reclaimed his field, unaware that anything significant had occurred. Rowe's report was delivered within days. The language was measured, as official documents tend to be, but the conclusion was unambiguous. The demonstration had succeeded. Radio detection of aircraft was feasible. The committee should recommend immediate funding for further development. The Air Ministry, not known for rapid decision-making, responded with unusual speed. Money was allocated. Facilities were promised. Watson Watt was told to assemble a team and get to work. The experiment at Upper Stowe had lasted less than a morning. It had cost almost nothing, some petrol, some borrowed BBC transmission time, one flight by an RAF bomber whose pilot was never told what he had helped prove. From this modest beginning, everything else would follow. The question now was whether Watson Watt could turn a successful demonstration into a working system before the war that everyone could see coming actually arrived. The test came in the summer of 1940. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving most of its equipment on the beaches. Britain stood alone against a German military machine that had conquered Western Europe in a matter of weeks. The Luftwaffe turned its attention across the Channel, beginning the aerial campaign that would determine whether invasion was possible. Before Chainholme, air defence had been largely a matter of hope and luck. Fighter squadrons maintained standing patrols, circling over likely approach routes and scanning the sky for enemy formations. When contact was made, it was usually by chance. A pilot might spot a glint of sunlight on distant wings, or notice a formation of dots that had not been there moments before. By the time fighters could climb to intercept, the bombers had often reached their targets and turned for home. Interception rates of 30% were considered respectable. More often, patrols returned having seen nothing at all. The mathematics of fuel consumption made this worse. A Spitfire carried enough petrol for about 90 minutes of flight. Time spent patrolling was time not available for combat. Squadrons that maintained constant patrols exhausted their aircraft and their pilots without ever engaging the enemy. The system was unsustainable against a determined offensive. Something had to change, and Chainholme was that something. The radar stations could see German formations assembling over France, sometimes more than 100 miles away. Operators watched the blips multiply on their screens as aircraft took off from bases around Calais and formed up for the crossing. They tracked the formations as they headed toward the Channel, estimating numbers and altitude from the strength and character of the returns. This information flowed to filter rooms where it was combined into a coherent picture, then passed to fighter controllers who could see the entire battle developing in something close to real time. The effect on RAF tactics was transformative. Pilots no longer needed to fly endless patrols, burning fuel and fatiguing themselves before combat even began. They could wait on the ground, resting beside their aircraft, until the radar picture showed exactly where and when they would be needed. Scramble orders came with specific vectors and altitudes. Squadrons climbed directly toward the intercept point, arriving with full fuel tanks and fresh pilots. The element of surprise shifted from attacker to defender. German commanders noticed that British fighters appeared with uncanny accuracy. Formations that should have reached their targets unmolested found Spitfires and Hurricanes waiting at precisely the right altitude. Raids that approached from unexpected directions were met as surely as those that came by obvious routes. The British seemed to know where every attack was heading before it arrived. Some Luftwaffe officers suspected espionage. Others attributed it to exceptional luck. Few understood that they were being watched from the moment they left the ground. On the 12th of August, the Luftwaffe attempted to blind this all-seeing system. Coordinated attacks struck radar stations along the south coast, dive bombers targeting the distinctive towers that had been photographed months earlier by the Graf Zeppelin. Several stations suffered damage. At Ventnor, on the Isle of Wight, the attack was particularly effective. Bombs struck the transmitter block and destroyed critical equipment. The station went off the air, creating a gap in coverage that would take weeks to fully repair. For a moment, it seemed the Germans had discovered Chain Home's vulnerability. The towers were impossible to hide and difficult to protect. A sustained campaign against the radar network could have degraded Britain's early warning capability precisely when it was needed most. Neighbouring stations could cover some of the gaps, but concentrated attacks would eventually create blind spots too large to compensate for. Then Reichsmarshal Goering made his decision. The attacks on radar stations had been costly. The towers remained standing even after direct hits, their open lattice construction allowing bombs to pass through without bringing them down. Repairing the actual equipment took time, but the British always seemed to get the stations back on the air. Goering concluded that the radar network was too difficult to destroy and not important enough to justify the losses. He ordered the Luftwaffe to concentrate on other targets: airfields, aircraft factories, eventually cities. It was perhaps his worst mistake of the war. The brief campaign against Chain Home had come closer to success than he realized. Continued pressure might have overwhelmed the repair crews and created lasting gaps in coverage. Instead, the radar network survived intact through the crucial weeks that followed. Controllers continued to see every raid as it developed. Fighters continued to arrive at the right place and time. The advantage that Watson Watt had built in a frozen field 5 years earlier remained firmly in British hands. The war ended. Britain survived. The invasion barges that had gathered in French ports were dispersed. The Luftwaffe turned east toward Russia, and the immediate threat to British cities receded into memory. Watson Watt, like many who had contributed to the war effort from laboratories rather than battlefields, faced the peculiar challenge of transitioning from indispensable to merely distinguished. Recognition came, as it usually does for successful civil servants, in measured increments. A knighthood was conferred in 1942, while the conflict still raged and the value of radar remained fresh in official memory. The ceremony at Buckingham Palace was brief and businesslike, as wartime investitures tended to be. Watson Watt knelt, felt the sword touch his shoulders, rose as Sir Robert, and returned to work. There was still a war to win, and the Germans were developing countermeasures that required British countermeasures in turn. The financial recognition took longer to arrange. Government committees moved slowly, even when acknowledging services that helped save the nation. A royal commission on awards to inventors was established to assess claims from scientists and engineers whose work had contributed to victory. Watson Watt submitted his case, documenting his role in the development of radar from the initial memorandum through the deployment of Chain Home. The commission deliberated, consulted experts, reviewed documentation, and eventually concluded that his contribution merited substantial compensation. In 1952, nearly a decade after the war's end, Sir Robert received approximately £50,000 from the British government. It was a considerable sum for the time, equivalent to several years of senior professional salary. The award acknowledged what everyone involved already knew, that his work had been worth rather more than the civil service pay scales had ever suggested. Other members of the radar development team received smaller awards, a recognition that Watson Watt had not worked alone, though he had certainly led. The money provided security and options. Watson Watt had spent his career in government service, moving from one official position to another, always working on problems defined by others. Now, in his 60s, he had the freedom to choose his own path. Britain in the early 1950s was a grey and rationed place, still recovering from the economic devastation of the war. The empire was dissolving, the global balance of power had shifted, and the country that Watson Watt had helped defend was no longer the power it had been. He looked westward, as many British professionals did in those years. Canada offered space, opportunity, and a certain freshness that exhausted Britain lacked. The Dominion was growing, developing its own technical capabilities, and welcomed experienced scientists and engineers from the mother country. Watson Watt emigrated, establishing himself as a consultant and enjoying the comfortable semi-retirement that his government payout had made possible. Life in Canada suited him. The pace was slower, the climate more dramatic, the social hierarchies less rigid than those he had navigated in Whitehall. He advised on technical matters when asked, lent his name and expertise to various projects, and generally enjoyed the status of a distinguished elder statesman of science. His wartime work was known and respected, though the details remained classified and the full story would not be told for many years. It was during this period, sometime in the 1950s, that Sir Robert experienced what might be called poetic justice. The precise date has been lost to history, or perhaps was never recorded. Watson Watt himself told the story with varying details on different occasions, as people do with anecdotes that improve with repetition. He was driving along a Canadian highway, perhaps faster than local regulations permitted. The road was straight, the traffic light, and the temptation to press the accelerator was one that many drivers would recognize. A police car appeared in his mirror, lights flashing. Watson Watt pulled over, already composing the apologetic explanation that might reduce his fine. The officer who approached his window was professionally courteous, as Canadian police tended to be. He explained that Sir Robert had been detected exceeding the speed limit. The detection method was radar, a technology that had migrated from military air defense to civilian traffic enforcement in the years since the war. Police departments across North America had discovered that the same principles Watson Watt had used to track bombers worked equally well for tracking speeding motorists. The officer was entirely unaware that the grey-haired gentleman sitting behind the wheel had any particular connection to the device that had just caught him. He wrote out the ticket, handed it through the window, and wished Sir Robert a good day and safer driving in future. Watson Watt accepted the citation with what grace he could muster, though his feelings about the encounter were decidedly mixed. There was something undeniably amusing about the situation. The man who had developed radar to defend Britain from aerial attack had been caught by radar while committing a minor traffic offence. The technology he had championed had proliferated far beyond its original purpose, finding applications he had never imagined when working in that frozen field near Daventry. Speed traps, weather forecasting, navigation systems, microwave ovens. Radar had become ubiquitous, woven into the fabric of modern life in ways both profound and mundane. Watson Watt, being the sort of man who processed experience through language, composed a short verse about his encounter with the Canadian traffic police. The poem circulated among his friends and eventually found its way into the public record, becoming one of the most quoted passages associated with his name. Pity Sir Robert Watson Watt, strange target of this radar plot, and thus, with others I can mention, the victim of his own invention. The verse captured something essential about the relationship between inventors and their inventions. Technologies, once released into the world, develop lives of their own. They find uses their creators never intended, solve problems that did not exist when they were developed, and sometimes turn around to bite the hands that made them. Watson Watt had given the world a way to see through darkness and distance. That same capability could spot a speeding car as easily as a bomber formation. In 1966, Watson Watt married for the third time. He was 74 years old. His bride was 67, a woman whose path had crossed his decades earlier in circumstances neither could have imagined would lead to this. Her name was Dame Catherine Trefusis Forbes. During the Battle of Britain, while Watson Watt's radar stations watched the skies, someone had to interpret what they saw. That task fell largely to young women of the WAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. They sat in underground bunkers at filter rooms, wearing headsets and pushing markers across plotting tables, translating the abstract blips on radar screens into actionable intelligence. Catherine Trefusis Forbes had commanded them. The creator of the system and the commander of those who operated it had known of each other during the war. They moved in overlapping circles, shared the same urgent purpose, but wartime is not conducive to personal connections. 26 years later, both widowed, both looking back on lives defined by that single desperate summer, they found each other. They settled in Scotland, in the village of Pitlochry. Watson Watt passed away in 1973. Catherine survived him by only 2 years. They are buried together, side by side, in a small Scottish churchyard. The technology he championed did not rest with him. Radar became the foundation of modern aviation, guiding aircraft through darkness and storms. It watches the weather, tracking hurricanes with the same principles Watson Watt once used to study lightning. It enforces speed limits on highways, catching drivers much as it once caught bombers. All of it traces back to a question asked in January 1935. Could radio waves build a death ray? The answer was no. But a young physicist named Wilkins added a footnote, and his superior had the wisdom to see what it meant. In a frozen field near Daventry, with borrowed BBC signals and improvised equipment, he proved that Britain could see its enemies coming. The rest is history. Though in this case, the history began with death rays and ended with 2 elderly people finding each other in a Scottish village, their lives bookended by a technology that changed the world. The money arrived faster than anyone expected. Within weeks of Rowe's report, Watson Watt had authorization to expand his team and move to a dedicated research site. The location chosen was Orford Ness, a narrow shingle spit jutting into the North Sea off the Suffolk coast. It was bleak, windswept, and almost impossible to reach without official transport. In other words, perfect for secret work. The War Office had used it for weapons testing during the previous conflict. Now it would serve a different purpose. Wilkins led the advance party, setting up equipment in abandoned military buildings that still smelled of cordite and damp. The conditions were primitive. Power supplies were unreliable. The nearest village offered limited amenities and unlimited curiosity about what the government men were doing on the peninsula. Watson Watt visited regularly, bringing new recruits and fresh ideas, then returning to London to fight bureaucratic battles for additional funding. The team grew from a handful to a dozen, then more. Young physicists and engineers arrived, drawn by the challenge and the sense that something important was happening. Progress came quickly once they had proper facilities. The borrowed BBC transmitter was replaced by purpose-built equipment. New antenna designs improved sensitivity and directionality. By summer, the detection range had stretched to 60 miles. An aircraft taking off from the continent could be spotted before it was halfway across the North Sea. The Air Ministry took note. Work on the competing acoustic detection systems was quietly terminated. The concrete sound mirrors along the south coast would remain as curiosities, monuments to a technological dead end. Radio had won. The success at Orford Ness created its own problems. A research station on an isolated spit was adequate for experiments. It was not suitable for developing an operational defence network. Watson Watt needed more space, more staff, and better access to the military commanders who would eventually use whatever system he built. In 1936, he got what he asked for. The Air Ministry acquired Bordsey Manor, a Victorian country house on the Suffolk coast with extensive grounds and a clear view of the sea. It became the new headquarters for radar development, though the word radar would not be coined for several more years. The task now was not merely to detect aircraft, but to build a chain of stations that could monitor the entire eastern and southern approaches to Britain. Each station would need massive transmitter towers, separate receiver arrays, underground operations rooms, and trained crews to interpret the signals. The project received a code name, Chain Home. It was an enormous undertaking, requiring coordination between scientists, engineers, construction crews, and the military. Watson Watt found himself spending as much time in meetings as in laboratories. The towers began rising along the coastline, impossible to hide from anyone who cared to look. Steel lattice structures 350 feet tall, supporting antenna arrays that faced out toward the sea. Local residents speculated about their purpose. Official explanations were vague, mentioning radio research and communications experiments. The structures looked too substantial for mere research, but asking too many questions was discouraged in those anxious years. The Germans noticed, of course. In the summer of 1938, the airship LZ-130 Graf Zeppelin made several flights along the British coast, ostensibly on training missions. In reality, it carried intelligence officers and radio monitoring equipment tasked with determining what the mysterious towers were for. The listeners detected powerful signals on unusual frequencies. They observed the regular patterns of transmission. They photographed the installations from the air. Their conclusion was reassuring to Berlin. The British, it seemed, were building an elaborate long-range naval communications network. The towers were probably intended to coordinate shipping movements or communicate with vessels in the Atlantic. There was no indication of any threat to the Luftwaffe. The intelligence assessment was filed and largely forgotten. It would prove to be one of the more consequential analytical failures of the pre-war period. By September 1938, as Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to negotiate with Hitler over Czechoslovakia, Chain Home began continuous operation. Around 20 stations now watched the eastern and southern approaches, their transmitters cycling day and night, their receivers scanning for any reflection that might indicate approaching aircraft. The crews worked in shifts, staring at oscilloscope screens for hours at a time, learning to distinguish genuine contacts from false echoes caused by weather, flocks of birds, or anomalies in the equipment. The system was not perfect. Far from it. The technology was crude by later standards, operating on frequencies that limited its precision and made it vulnerable to interference. Determining the exact position and altitude of a contact required skill and experience. Different operators could interpret the same signals differently, but it worked. For the first time in history, a nation had the ability to see aircraft approaching from beyond the horizon, in any weather, at any hour. The bomber would not always get through, not anymore. Chain Home operated on frequencies between 22 and 50 MHz. To a radio engineer, this was an odd choice. Lower frequencies meant longer wavelengths, which meant less precision in determining exactly where a target was. The system could tell you that aircraft were approaching from the southeast at roughly 80 miles distance, but it could not pinpoint their position with the accuracy that higher frequencies would allow. The beams were broad, the returns were fuzzy, and skilled interpretation was needed to extract useful information from the green traces dancing on the cathode ray tubes. The German equivalent, a system called FRIAR, used higher frequencies and more sophisticated electronics. On paper, it was the superior technology. The resolution was sharper, the range estimation more precise, the overall design more elegant. German engineers had approached the problem methodically, determining the optimal frequencies first, and then building equipment to operate at those frequencies. This was the logical way to develop a new technology. Define the requirements, design to meet them, then manufacture the result. German engineering culture prided itself on this systematic approach. Watson Watt had taken a different path. Instead of asking what frequencies would be ideal, he had asked what frequencies could be achieved with existing British industrial capacity. The radio manufacturing sector could produce reliable components for the 22 to 50 MHz range. Factories were already tooled for this work. Engineers understood the technology and its quirks. Training programs could be established using familiar equipment. Spare parts could be sourced from domestic suppliers without waiting for specialized production runs. Higher frequencies would have yielded sharper results. Watson Watt knew this perfectly well. He had studied the physics, understood the trade-offs, and made a deliberate choice to accept inferior performance in exchange for faster deployment. This was not ignorance or incompetence, it was strategy. He called his approach the cult of the imperfect. The phrase was partly self-mocking, an acknowledgement that what he was building fell short of what was theoretically possible. But it was also a serious statement of engineering philosophy, one that he repeated to his team often enough that some of them grew tired of hearing it. The core principle could be summarized in a single sentence. Give them the third best to go on with. The second best comes too late. The best never comes. The logic was unanswerable, at least to anyone who understood the strategic situation Britain faced. A working radar network in 1938 was infinitely more valuable than a perfect radar network in 1942. The Luftwaffe would not wait for British engineers to optimize their frequencies. German aircraft production was accelerating. German pilots were gaining experience in Spain. German strategists were planning campaigns that would rely on air superiority. If Chain Home could detect bombers at 100 miles with current technology, then current technology would have to do. This philosophy permeated every decision at Bawdsey Manor. When engineers proposed improvements that would require new manufacturing processes, Watson Watt asked how long the retooling would take. When scientists suggested waiting for better vacuum tubes that were under development, he asked what was available now. When junior staff complained that the equipment was inelegant, he reminded them that elegance was not a military requirement. Detection was, speed was, reliability under operational conditions was, beauty was for peacetime. The contrast with German development philosophy could not have been sharper. Freyr was an excellent system, technically superior to Chain-Home in most measurable respects. But the Germans kept refining it, waiting for each generation of components to reach maturity before committing to large-scale production. They identified problems and delayed deployment until solutions were found. They held equipment back for additional testing when anomalies appeared in field trials. This was responsible engineering practice. It was also, in the context of a looming war, a strategic error. By 1939, Germany had only a handful of operational Freyr stations, concentrated on the North Sea coast to watch for British naval movements. The system was not integrated into a comprehensive air defence network because no such network existed. German military doctrine emphasised offensive air power. Bombers would destroy enemy air forces on the ground. Fighters would establish air superiority over the battlefield. The idea that Germany itself might need to defend against sustained aerial attack was not seriously entertained. Radar was a useful tool for coastal surveillance, not a foundation for national defence. Britain, meanwhile, had Chain-Home, 20 stations watching the eastern and southern approaches, crews trained to interpret the fuzzy returns and extract actionable intelligence, communications links connecting each station to a central filter room where the information could be combined into a coherent picture, fighter squadrons ready to scramble based on that picture. The system was imperfect at every level, but it existed, it worked, and it was getting better with each month of operational experience. Watt's willingness to deploy imperfect equipment had another advantage that was not immediately obvious. Real-world operation revealed problems that testing could never uncover. The crews at Chain-Home stations discovered that certain weather conditions created false echoes. They learned that flocks of birds could mimic aircraft formations on the screens. They found that some operators were better at interpreting signals than others, and they developed training programs to spread this expertise. Each discovery led to improvements in procedures, equipment, or both. This iterative approach accelerated development far beyond what laboratory work alone could achieve. Problems were identified and solved in weeks rather than months. Modifications were tested under operational conditions and refined based on immediate feedback. The system evolved continuously, becoming more capable even as it remained fundamentally imperfect. By the time the war began, Chain-Home had accumulated years of operational experience. The operators knew their equipment intimately, understood its limitations, and had developed techniques to work around them. The German approach produced superior hardware but inferior systems. Each Freyr station was a standalone installation, operated by specialists who reported through military channels that were not designed for rapid dissemination of tactical intelligence. The information gathered was valuable for strategic assessment, but difficult to use for immediate fighter direction. German engineers had optimized the components while neglecting the system. British engineers, under Watt's direction, had done the opposite. There was also a psychological dimension to the cult of the imperfect. Engineers are trained to seek optimal solutions. They take pride in elegant designs that meet specifications precisely. Asking them to deliberately build something crude goes against their professional instincts. Watt had to convince his team that good enough really was good enough, that their reputations would not suffer from deploying equipment that fell short of theoretical ideals. This required constant reinforcement. Visiting scientists from universities sometimes expressed surprise at the apparent primitiveness of Chain-Home. Watt learned to preempt their criticism by explaining his philosophy before they could offer suggestions for improvement. Yes, higher frequencies would be better. Yes, more sophisticated antenna designs would improve resolution. Yes, the display systems were rudimentary compared to what could be achieved with additional development. All true, all irrelevant to the immediate task of building something that worked before the bombers came. Some improvements were incorporated, of course. Watt was not opposed to progress, merely to progress that delayed deployment. When better components became available from existing production lines, they were integrated into new stations. When operators developed more effective techniques, these were standardized across the network. When obvious flaws were identified that could be fixed without major redesign, fixes were implemented. The system improved continuously, without ever pausing for a comprehensive upgrade. Chain Home in September 1939 was substantially better than Chain Home in September 1938. Chain Home in September 1940 would be better still, but at no point was the system taken offline for modernization. At no point did the Air Ministry announce that operations would be suspended while improved equipment was installed. The network remained active, watching, learning, and improving in place. The cult of the imperfect would prove to be one of Watt's most important contributions to British defence, not the physics, which others understood equally well, not the engineering, which his team executed, but the philosophy that allowed imperfect physics and imperfect engineering to produce a system that was ready when it was needed. In the summer of 1940, this difference in approach would matter more than any specification sheet could measure.